Welcome to this virtual World Ocean Summit hosted by The Economist. I'm Jan Piotrowski. I'm The Economist's business editor with a keen interest in all things oceanic. I was previously the environment correspondent and followed these subjects very closely. That makes me very, very happy to introduce today's discussion. And the panel is about plastics and collaboration for critical wins in plastic circularity. And to discuss this subject, which is obviously top of mind to many people who care about the ocean, I'm joined by four excellent and experienced panelists. We have Nina Jensen, who's the chief executive of REV Ocean, Umesh Patke, who's the president and director of PT L'Oreal Indonesia, Marco ten Bruggenkate, who's the commercial vice president for packaging and specialty plastics in the EMEA region for Dow, and Atsushi Tsunami, who's the president of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. You'll find the full biographies of all our panelists on the screen under the media player if you want to familiarize yourselves with them. Right, let's get right into it. Nina, I would like to start with you. Obviously, we've lived through a rather unusual couple of years. Before the pandemic, plastics and ocean pollution and the environment more broadly was really rising up the hierarchy of priorities for many policymakers and for many people, certainly in the West. Has that changed over the past 2 years? I mean, lots of other things have happened. Has the problem of plastic pollution taken a back seat to more pressing, immediate problems of the pandemic?
Well, it's a good question. And of course, there has been a lot of other things that have been pushed up to the top of the agenda given a global pandemic. But I think the awareness and the understanding of the severity of the plastic problem, also further exacerbated by all the plastics that have been produced over the past 2 years to deal with the plastics, to deal with the pandemic, has just further emphasize the importance of dealing with it. I think a challenge has been to enable global collaboration towards solving the problem. And of course, given the global nature of the plastic problem, cooperation is absolutely essential. But without being able to bring the right players together around the table to discuss what the solutions are, that has, of course, dramatically hampered the progress on solving plastic pollution.
So, Umesh and Marco, since you're representing the private sector, I would like to ask both of you the sort of a version of the same question. So, with Umesh, maybe start with you. So, within your organization, in the past 2 years, obviously, a part of that, especially the early part of the pandemic, was crisis mode. How has the position of the plastics problem changed over the past 2 years? Is it where it was in December 2019, or has it dropped down the list of priorities?
No, absolutely not. And I, want to clarify that L'Oreal has been committed to sustainability for a very long time. And just because the pandemic came along, that did not change our priorities. The people on sustainability are obviously working on sustainability, and it is the top priority for them. And sustainability has been a big priority for the rest of the organization all through the pandemic. It is about first reducing our plastic footprint, and second, about improving the circularity of plastics that we are putting out into the market. And we've played a very big role on that, especially in Indonesia, because we are working in a country which is surrounded by oceans, an archipelago, 17,000 islands. So the importance of keeping the oceans clean of plastic is re-emphasized anytime any of us visits a beach and sees tons of plastic lying over there. So my biggest brand here is Garnier in Indonesia. And in fact, during the pandemic, we launched a program called Garnier Green Beauty, which is a holistic program that works with government bodies in order to improve plastic recycling. it enables consumers and encourages and incentivizes consumers to recycle plastic and collect plastic at their home and give it out to recycling agencies. Today, we have more than 100,000 people in Indonesia who've downloaded the app and are able to recycle their plastics. As of last count, we had recycled 100 tons of plastic that we had put out, and the aim is to get millions of people to download the app and enable them to recycle the plastic so that less of it enters into the ocean. So put an underline to the point, sustainability is in fact more important. We realize that because of the pandemic, possibly the use of plastics has increased in other sectors, not necessarily among cosmetics, but that will be even more urgent as the pandemic ends, and makes it important for us to continue focusing on it. Thank you.
So Marco, for Dow, obviously companies, like any organization, have limited resources. There is not an infinite amount of money, human capital to devote to solving all the problems and fixing all the externalities. So, do you think that Dow, which I'm sure has also continued, its sustainability practices throughout the pandemic, do you think it would have been further along had it not been for the pandemic? So, was there any diversion of resources, or maybe not so much diversion of resources even, but the fact that you could have got further along were it not for the pandemic, or do you think that these two things are completely independent?
Yeah, thanks, Jan. I wouldn't say they're completely independent, but let me say that we have definitely not stopped anything. If anything, the whole movement have accelerated since 2 years. You only have to look at Europe and look at what the European Commission has come out with to see that the framework, the amount of policy, proposed legislation, really needs to put industry in the mode of wanting to change. So we're really in the transformation mode. Here at Dow, we completely understand that we have two roles to play. First of all, in the developing world, where we really need to make sure that plastics don't enter into the environment. And we really work with a whole host of partnerships to enable that. I mean, you've got the Alliance to End Plastics Waste, where our own CEO, Jim Fidling, has taken recently the chairmanship, and we're cooperating around 60 projects around the world to enable the collection and making sure plastics don't end up in the environment. We have we are a founding member of a fund called Circular Capital, and Circular Capital has been funded really to enable also the collection of plastic waste and avoid again that it ends up in the environment. And there's already quite a few very nice examples where we have funded companies across the world who then subsequently got additional funding through that as well. So, and on top, we also did our own funding. We just recently announced a fund in Mr. Green Africa, whereby we ensure that a local recycler gets the ability to further scale their operations to collect, sort, and ultimately bring post-consumer recycle back to brand owners like L'Oreal and many others who are demanding these type of products. So I didn't think it stopped. And in the developing world, we announced last year a couple of partnerships to really scale chemical recycling, because there it's really all about making the product circular. And chemical recycling is a very important complementary technology to fulfill the EU's ambitions to reach the 30% targets in terms of recycled content in packaging. So I wouldn't say at all. If anything, we've actually dedicated more resources, because we see this as a complete transformation of our company. We see this as an opportunity, and ultimately we want to become a leading provider of circular solutions at the lowest possible CO2 emissions. And we haven't even talked about decarbonization, which intersects with this very clearly.
I do plan to actually go back to decarbonization at a later stage of the discussion, so let's put a pin in that. But before that, Atsushi, I have a question for you. I mean, you're a keen observer of the policy making in this area, obviously specifically in Japan, but I suspect not only. And basically a version of the question that I asked for the private sector about the public sector. has the momentum in favor of dealing with the plastic problem at the government level, has that been maintained through the pandemic, or did it slow? It would have been for a very understandable reason. There was a crisis to deal with.
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question, and I think first of all, I think I would like to echo what Nina has been saying, that the public awareness of the importance of this plastic issue have been really affected. I think the usage of unfortunately the usage of single-use plastics because of the pandemic, such as people are staying home and all the food deliveries, and in case of Japan, we use a lot of lunches and so on and so forth that are all made of the single-use plastics, and that was very unfortunate in a way to have the demand for plastics to be increased because of the pandemic. But because of this, the awareness of the crisis of the created by this plastics waste is being really widely shared. But of course, the policy side, it was very the fighting against pandemic for most countries is the top priorities ever. And once you are trying to really see some of the the restrictions on the single-use plastic would have to be really pretty much put aside in many ways. In my experience working with the government, but in terms of the discussion of the policy, I think it has really continued. So we follow up on the G20 Osaka, and then to the next G20 in Saudi, and the dialogue is going and going and going. So the policy dialogue itself, it has continued. So, but the problem is the action. And so how are we going to put those into implementation in actual practice? While you're staying home, and it's so much you can do in terms of physically trying to make it. But the policy dialogue is continuing. I think it has progressed quite a bit, creating indexes and so on and so forth. Yes.
Can I ask you one follow-up question on because you mentioned obviously that during the pandemic, a lot of consumers have started using more plastics, ordering food, deliveries of all sorts, and so on and so forth. Again, for understandable reasons, and it's a sort of trade-off. Is that an illustration of the fact that the societal concern for this was actually pretty shallow? The revealed preference here is, we will use more plastics when we need to, and ultimately we don't care all that much. We care when we see it in David Attenborough's film. That film's, everyone watched it a couple of years ago. Other things, came to mind. We didn't go to beaches because we were stuck at home, so we didn't see it wash up. So do you think that this is an illustration of a sort of A, out of sight, out of mind, and B, the fact that really people care about other things much more than they care about this, and therefore instituting lasting change will be difficult?
No, I think there's a question about the people's mindset, but also about the choice that they were able to make. And I think in many cases, what I've seen in this part of the world is really that they didn't have much choice, I guess, in terms of creating more alternative materials for usage for lunch boxes or the food delivery and so on and so on. But also, there are more understanding for or need for recycling. So that part actually being reflected by some of the concerns that the people already have and awareness of the problem. So,
Nina, I think you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I certainly don't think that people care less about the plastic problem. But of course, facing a global pandemic, you are predominantly focusing on your health and the health of your loved ones. So then that has top priority. I also think that solving the plastic problem cannot be put on individual consumers. It is the responsibility of regulators and, of course, predominantly the industry itself that is producing all of this plastics. So over the past decade, we have produced more plastics than in the entire past century. And this is expected to double over the next 20 years, which is, of course, making a huge profit to those producing the plastics and causing a major problem for the ocean, for the environment, and for global human health. So, despite the pandemic pushing this as a priority down the list, it should be pushed up on the list for the industry and for the global corporations that really have to come up with the solutions to solve this. And it won't be solved without global cooperation. It won't be solved without global regulation. And it won't be solved unless we find ways of producing this material so that it can be 100% recyclable.
Marco, I think you wanted to come in here.
Yeah, and I agree with Nina, what Nina said, especially also the last comment with respect to making plastics recyclable, because in the end of the day, the plastics industry, the whole value chain has done a great job in making plastics certainly more functional from a CO2 footprint over the last decade, from how it appears on the shelf, the functionality in terms of packing the good, the line speeds on their manufacturing lines. But what we haven't looked at is the end of life. And this really needs to change. This really needs to start with the end of life and making sure that packages on the market are recyclable. Once you do that, then you create the ability to loop back into the system. And that means that the value chain needs to get at work. We'll need to invest in recycling equipment, infrastructure to enable this, because just making it recyclable will not be enough. And then you also need to create the demand to enable that brand owners will pick it up. Now, the brand owners have made very significant commitments by 2025 to be able to put significant amounts of recycled content into their packaging structures. So the drive and the will is there. And we just need to make sure that as an overall value chain, we live up to that commitment to do that. And we can't do that alone as Dow. We're committed, we invest, but we need to do that as a whole industry. And I see an industry which is very engaged to change. As to Nina's point, we need change. We absolutely need to see that. And we need more of that to come in the next years. This is not going to happen in 1 or 2 years. This really is this needs to be a sustained systemic change.
It's interesting. I mean, you can almost imagine that the pandemic is an interesting sort of reset button here. That on the one hand, it's made communication like this much easier. So, Nina said that we haven't obviously got together in a room for the past 2 years. That's true. We got together in an awful lot more virtual rooms. So in a way, this sort of, the pandemic might have, just by making the sort of technology that we're using right now, more widespread, may make collaboration easier, because it's easier to bring people together. And at the same time, when we do start meeting each other, everybody will be really keen to get into the room together and talk and hash things out. So I wonder whether there's sort of this is a tiny silver lining to this whole awful 2 years. Nina, I think you wanted to jump in again.
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent point. I actually think that the past 2 years have also, in many ways, lowered the threshold in terms of connecting and reaching out to people. And I've certainly connected with a lot more innovators, tech experts, and solution providers all over the world, because of this virtual collaboration has enabled more people to actually connect. So it hasn't necessarily advanced the scale of global cooperation that is needed to solve the plastic problem, but it certainly sparked a lot of innovation and engagement and connections one-on-one to individuals that can possibly contribute to solving the problem. So it's twofold, and hopefully the sum of that has created enough momentum so that over the next couple of years we will see dramatic change in terms of how we resolve plastic pollution.
So, Umesh, I would like to ask you whether you have a sense of whether this is also happening in your part of the world. Has the pandemic made it easier to bring people together, sort of ironically?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of the speakers have talked about technology being an enabler to collaboration and bringing everyone together. So that's quite obvious. But let's go back to who are the key players over here and how each one of them is playing a role in the context of the pandemic. So the government, let's start with regulators or governments. I mean, governments have not let down their policies or stopped making policies around increasing or pushing, people to use less plastic. For example, plastic bags are not used in many supermarkets and hypermarkets these days. People are encouraged to carry their own bags, or there's kind of a reward and punishment over there. Let's look at manufacturers. A lot of manufacturers have made major commitments, L'Oreal being one of them, that by 2025, all of our hair care bottles will use only recycled plastics. Now, that's a very big commitment, and that comes working with manufacturers like Dow or other manufacturers to make sure that enough post-use or recycled plastic is available before that are being made in are recycled from the environment. And then let's look at consumers. Consumers have to be enabled. You can push consumers to not use plastic bags by taking them out of the system. But then there is so much other plastic that is being used in their homes. We talked about home delivery of food. Consumers have to be enabled or given a kind of reward or processes or tools for them to put in place their desire or act on their desire to recycle plastic. And again, I go back I would encourage all of you to download that and take a look at it, because it allows consumers to call for someone to pick it up so that it gets collected from their home, and they get a reward for doing that. So overall, we are not just talking the talk, but also walking the walk in terms of consumers the ability to recycle, consumers the ability to get back the plastic into the recycled chain. And all this has been possible because of the technological advancements. I mean, apps, connectivity, all the stuff that's happening and which has accelerated during the pandemic is in many ways enabling this. Thank you.
So, Marco, you oversee Dow's, parts of Dow's business in a variety of very different places. So, from very rich Europe to pretty poor Africa, and through the Middle East. Do you see a difference in the sort of both consumer awareness and consumer priorities? And I mean, you would imagine that in places where people really must care first and foremost about their livelihood, concern about whether or not they're polluting is might be slightly lower than in places where people have the luxury, in places like Europe, where people have the luxury to think about other things. Is that something that makes this increasing consumer awareness harder?
I'm not sure. I wouldn't say that people certainly in Africa, and I've been to Kenya several times, and certainly also with the partnership we have with Mr. Green Africa, it's very clear that people absolutely care about their environment. At the same token, it's a funding problem. And how do you actually set up that whole infrastructure? Because it's not very high on the priority of the local governments, whose first priority is to provide food, jobs and shelter to the people, and this comes way down that list. So that's where private initiatives come into play, or private-public initiatives. An actual fact, an interesting initiative, which to just bring my point home that consumers are interested in it, similar to what I'm hearing from Umesh in Indonesia, is with Mr. Green Africa, we developed a platform, an app, whereby consumers can subscribe, and basically a Uber-like function can call off the segregated plastic waste. And the idea is to have 250,000 of these consumers just in the, I'll call it the Nairobi area, in the middle and higher income class, to be subscribed to this tool so that we can actually take that plastic waste and recycle it back into applications like L'Oreal is using.
So, Nina, I think you wanted to jump in here as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to say there are two main problems here, particularly in most of these countries where plastic pollution is a serious problem, is that there is no waste management or proper waste management facilities. We know that more than 3/4 of all the plastics that have ever been produced are stuck in landfills or littering the environment, and that's the problem we need to get to. This means that there is a huge responsibility on the shoulders of those that have produced the plastic and those that are using it, predominantly the industrial players. And they, together with the local governments, have to be responsible for implementing the necessary waste management facilities so that the plastic is actually taken care of. We cannot put this responsibility on the individual consumers' shoulders. This is, of course, they can make better choices and they can try to recycle, but it doesn't really help if the plastics ends up in a landfill and then ultimately into the environment. So this is the problem that we need to solve. We need adequate waste management facilities, and we need to make sure that the plastics is recyclable so that it's actually collected and reused, so that we can further reduce the use of virgin plastics into the production.
Actually, the interesting thing about, from my recollection of trying to look into this subject when I was covering the environment, the interesting thing about this business is that obviously recycled plastic can be more expensive, or it can be competitive with virgin plastic, very much depending on the price of the raw material. Right now, the price of the raw material, petroleum, is very high, which makes, at this stage, makes recycled plastic more competitive. So again, the pandemic-related spike in the oil price might bring a silver lining to this business. It seems to me, although obviously the big problem is the fluctuations in the oil price and the fact that if it suddenly drops down again, the virgin stuff becomes much more enticing to people, to CFOs, as opposed to maybe other people within an organization. Asushi, I wanted to come back to you because obviously the idea here is to talk a little bit about how to improve collaboration between the public sector, private sector, and civil society in this. And collaboration is a great word. It's also incredibly copious and incredibly fuzzy. So I would like to get a sense from you what you think are the good types of forum. What are the mechanisms whereby you can actually collaborate? Because obviously talking in forums like this is one thing. It's great, it's enjoyable, it's interesting. But to get things done, you need certain mechanisms that translate this goodwill and discussion into changes on the ground. So what do you see, maybe from the Japanese perspective? What are the forums and the mechanisms whereby the various actors can cooperate in practice?
Actually, what I've seen observing the last few years, because of the pandemic, the good side, the positive impact on this in terms of collaboration is that different levels of government is now collaborating together in order to cope with this emergent, common enemy that we have to fight together. And I think that really channeling into the issue of climate crisis and other things, but including marine plastics. You can see now that we are finding the mechanism to collaborate with the state level government, to a local government, city and level governments, and the civil society and the people in the world that are trying to work together in terms of actually putting a good action. And I think, and also the key to link these stakeholders is a new platform created. Usually is in the case in Japan is created by something like the new apps for smartphone apps that really brings the people, individuals, to really capture some of the information that are going on the plastic waste they take the photos, they upload the information to this application, and they instantly we can share this kind of information where the collected waste are and how those need to be collected and all these things. Not only initiated by the government, but it's the private and the individuals and consumers that are actually providing information to the government instantly. So these are the new kind of mechanism we use, particularly using cell phones because of the smartphone applications that really originally thought about, say, using the pandemics and tracking where the people or the people's information about the the vaccines and so on and so forth that are providing to individual consumers through these apps. So I think new technology, new innovation, and also the willingness of each level of the government that are now ready to collaborate in this one particular. I think this would be a great sort of a momentum for the use of the tackling the issue of plastics.
It's really interesting. It's a very good point that basically the pandemic has forced many people to cooperate in a way that was not, centrally orchestrated. I mean, obviously, very often governments had a coordinating role, but a lot was sort of left to individuals. And I actually want to come back to Umesh for precisely asking this question. I see what you want to chip in, but my question to you would be: have you found that basically the willingness of government, just because the private sector stepped up in many cases when it came to the pandemic, in the way that they organized, their operations, in the way that they tried to take care of their workers' health, and so on and so forth. There was a lot of activity on the part of the private sector, which was very laudable throughout the pandemic. And has that endeared them in the eyes of governments? Has that made cooperation on other things with governments easier, do you think?
No, I don't think that is a particular point. It's possibly one step in the right direction, but collaboration between private sector and governments, it's something that has to be built over the years in terms of relationships, in terms of, again, walking the talk and doing the right things and enabling the governments to achieve their part of the agenda while private sector also achieves their part of the agenda. I think couple of things. First is we have to get this thing out of our minds that the pandemic has led to environmentalism or sustainability taking a backseat. That's not the case. Yes, in terms of individuals, the choices might have been health and protection over recycling plastic. But like Nina said, I completely agree. The role of the governments and regulators and role of big corporations, role of manufacturers is much larger here than the role of the individual consumers. And that is where the tripartite work together is really bearing fruit, if I may say, or will bear fruit in the future. So if I take the private sector or corporations, we making commitments is now also reflecting in terms of positive feedback when it comes to the markets, because we are, truth be told, driven by the markets. And if the markets are rewarding sustainable behavior, if the markets are rewarding stuff that we do around plastic circularity and all that, we will do more of it. And while we believe it's the right thing to do, it is also the financially sustainable thing to do. So the markets are rewarding us. The governments are also rewarding us because we are taking the right steps and we are enabling the governments to do what they want to do and taking, collaborative steps on that. Once there is demand created by private sector, by manufacturers or users of plastics, people like Dow are obviously going to be incentivized to innovate in that direction, are going to be incentivized to work collaboratively with us. So it's more about this trifecta working really effectively. And one point I wanted to add is, we have to find solutions which are different for different markets, different environments. We've talked a lot about Indonesia and Africa, and these are big producers or users of plastics. And there are very local, innovative solutions that need to be found in order to address the issue of landfills, in order to address the issue of segregation of plastics, in order to address the issue of collection and reaching the plastic back to the recyclers. But that's obviously the role that people like Dow, ourselves, and the governments are going to play. Thank you.
No, yeah, that is interesting. And also the other thing I think that happened during the pandemic is that even within the private sector, we saw a lot more collaboration, even between rivals within individual industries. To the extent that in the pharmaceutical industry is one obvious example. Something that might otherwise have at any other time have looked like formation of a small cartel was sort of allowed to happen for the greater public good, and again, allowed to happen by governments. They sort of turned a blind eye to certain forms of co-opetition that they might have been less tolerant of in other times. Marco, I did want to come back, as I mentioned earlier, to this idea of decarbonization, because the one question that I always have is, to what extent is there a trade-off between trying to decarbonize a certain company and trying to reduce the reliance on plastics or change the plastic profile? There probably are some overlaps, but are there any trade-offs? Is an extra dollar spent on decarbonization a dollar less for the plastics project?
I don't think so. In actual fact, it's interesting because circularity was really the key topic a few years ago. Now, when you talk about circularity, and I'm talking more in the developed regions, circularity and decarbonization need to go hand in hand. So reusing raw materials really needs to lead to that more efficient use of carbon. If that doesn't do that and it increases carbon, then you really need to wonder why you're doing circularity at all. In the developing regions, it's a little bit different. Now, in our case, when you look at plastics in many cases are already the most efficient solution with respect to the packaging of goods. If they wouldn't be, then they shouldn't be used either. We'll be very clear in that. But that doesn't excuse us, obviously, from looking to further optimize the carbon footprint of these products. Because when you look at the overall production of plastics, it does emit a lot of CO2 emissions. So what we're doing in that space is, I'll give you a couple of very practical examples. In Europe, pretty much 90% of our facilities are all running on renewable energy, 100%. That's one. The second thing is that we have roadmaps for all of our facilities in place to decarbonize them. And the most obvious one is Terneuzen. This is a big site in the Netherlands we've got, whereby we put a roadmap into place to reduce the scope 1 and 2 by 40% in 2028, to make sure that ultimately through carbon capture, we can actually get to that 40% reduction and go to the next step with a breakthrough partnership, which actually you could argue is a rival in the industry, to your point, Jan, earlier on, with Shell, whereby we're working and collaborating on electrified cracking, which enables us to use renewables instead of fossil fuel, further reducing the CO2 emissions. So all of these investments make a huge impact. Also on scope 3, we will continue to use, for example, non-virgin fossil feedstocks like bio, like also the chemical recycle feedstocks, which we talked about earlier, to further reduce our CO2 footprint. So the investments which go into it are very significant. The industry is investing. There is obviously a need for very coherent and clear policy, particularly in the European Union, and making sure that single market is upheld and it doesn't get fragmented too much. And waste is also seen as a raw material which can freely flow between the countries so that it is actually becoming a valuable material. But other than that, the commitment is absolutely there in the investment.
Well, I'm afraid we've basically run out of time. This has been a very interesting discussion and actually quite a heartening one. We're meeting in this rather, imperfect setting, it would be really nice to be with you all. But it does show that collaboration is possible even in trying circumstances like the past 2 years. And hopefully we'll see ever more of it thanks to platforms such as this, including at future World Ocean Summits. So I'd like to thank all of you for a very interesting and bracing panel, and good luck. And hopefully we can hear some progress reports in coming months.